Welcome back to the California Dream. This is Darren Brown, and this is the weekly roundup for July 17th. So the big news this week is the deal on the infrastructure bill reached by the Democrats in the Senate. The price tag is $3.5 trillion. And before I go any further, I'll just say, would we be better off with passing this bill as opposed to not passing it? Of course, there's a lot of good things in this bill, and there's a lot of good proposals in it that'll help people, and that's fine. But I just want to put some things into perspective here, because when you look at the dollar amount, 3.5 trillion, that sounds like a lot of money, but I'm going to remind you of a few facts. So first, that $3.5 trillion price tag is spent over a 10-year period. So that really means we're looking at about $350 billion each year. Also, to put the number into perspective, Bernie Sanders had a climate proposal during his 2020 campaign, and the dollar amount for that proposal was $16 trillion, $16 trillion over a similar time period. So 3.5 trillion compared to 16 trillion. 3.5 is a lot smaller than 16. I've also read estimates of between 3 trillion and 7 trillion just to upgrade the US power grid. Okay, so just one piece of infrastructure. So that's not counting, the entire infrastructure of the U.S. That's not counting everything for addressing climate change. That's not counting any of the other social programs or anything else in this bill. Just the power grid, $3 to $7 trillion. So that hopefully starts to put this $3.5 trillion number a little more into perspective. But I can make an even more dramatic case. And bear with me here because we have to sort through some economic numbers and calculations. So the United States annual GDP, gross domestic product, is about $21 trillion. This Senate deal is proposing $350 billion. Okay, so the US GDP, 21 trillion with a T. This proposed Senate deal is 350 billion with a B. If you get out your calculator and you divide 350 billion by 21 trillion, you find it's about 1.7%. Okay, that's it. 1.7% of the economy. To put this into comparison, United States spends about 17% of its GDP on healthcare. So even if this Senate bill passes, the United States would still be spending 10 times as much money on healthcare as on infrastructure and climate change. Does that sound like an amount commensurate to the crisis that's staring us in the face? I mean, just look at what's happened in California recently. We've had record heat waves, wildfire, drought. Up in the Northwest, we have people literally dying from the heat. And yet we're only proposing spending 1/10 of what we already spend on healthcare every year. Here's some more historical numbers to put this into context. At the height of World War II, the U.S. was devoting almost 40% of its economy to the war effort. Okay? 40%, almost 40% of GDP was going to defense. Okay. In 1946, the national debt was 115% of GDP. Okay, so when you hear people go on about, oh my gosh, the national debt, it's bigger than the economy. Well, that's not a new thing. In 1946, the national debt was larger than the annual GDP. It was 115%. Now, if you really think the climate crisis is an existential threat on the scale of World War II, if you really think it's that serious, why are we sitting around congratulating ourselves on a proposal that will only spend 1.7% of GDP? Okay, 1.7% versus almost 40% that we already spent in World War II. During World War II, relative to the size of the economy, we spent 20 times as much money to defeat the Nazis as what's being proposed in Washington for infrastructure and climate right now. And by the way, what was the result of all this deficit spending? What was the result of having this enormous national debt in the 1940s? Think of all the fear-mongering you hear right now. Did the United States suffer hyperinflation? Did the United States default on its debt? Did the United States become Zimbabwe? Did it fall into economic collapse? Oh, no, that's right. We had the golden age of capitalism, right? Right, that's what they call it? The post-war period from the mid-1940s to the mid-1970s. This was economically the greatest period of American history. So take that into account. Democrats are patting themselves on the back. Bernie's patting himself on the back. And we probably won't even get $3.5 trillion after it goes through the meat grinder and the committees and the parliamentarian and all the ridiculous bureaucracy that they have there. Manchin and Sinema have their say. It's probably only going to be $2 trillion, maybe even $1.5 trillion. It's a joke. America is doing nothing to address this catastrophe playing out in real time. Nothing. So, here in California, we have two choices. We could just give up and say, well, I guess there's nothing we can do. I guess we just can't get America to do anything. Or we can just say, screw them. We have to do something. If we said we're independent right now, if we had our own currency, if we controlled our own spending, we could at least mobilize the resources that need mobilizing here in California, and we can show the rest of the country that it can be done. And eventually, as with everything, they'll realize, oh shit, they figured out what needed to be done way before us. We better go and copy them. That's about the only hope I can see. There's more I could say about this plan. The idea that it needs to be fully funded or deficit neutral. This is one of the big ways that they're going to scale it down, is this idea of deficit neutrality, the pay-fors, that any new spending that's going to be added has to be offset by some tax increase. And then they're going to say, well, we don't want to raise taxes too much, so what are you going to do? I've talked about this before, how this is really a false narrative. The taxes don't actually pay for the spending, so the whole line of reasoning is just ridiculous. There's also something that I noticed with this bill that not many people have talked about. It's called, quote unquote, asset recycling. So you might think, what is asset recycling? That sounds like a very strange term. That's a euphemism for privatization. It means that the state is selling off or leasing assets to increase revenue, right? So we're just talking about deficit neutrality, meaning if you're going to spend, you have to bring in revenue. Well, one of the ways you could offset spending by revenue is to just sell stuff. You know, the state owns stuff, just give it away to corporations. Now, that's bad enough when it's done at the state, county, municipal level. Okay, it's a bad idea there. But for the federal government to do it is complete insanity. And for the same reason that I just went over. There is no need to offset the spending. You know, all you're doing when you say something like, oh, we're going to sell off these assets so that we can pay for this other spending, because the revenue that you get from selling the assets has nothing to do with the ability to spend on what you want to spend. really all that you're doing is just giving things to corporations. You're just giving stuff away. For what reason? No reason. And I haven't really heard many people talking about this. I'll put a link to a couple articles on this, but this is insanity. But that's what they're going to be doing here. So I'll be coming back to this particular aspect of this bill later, because this is a topic I want to talk about in general more. But, you know, when we eventually have millions of climate refugees, when we're all sitting around dealing with half the earth being unlivable for humans, when these extreme weather events keep destroying our homes and our lives, hey, at least we'll be able to say we kept the national debt in check. While we're just sitting there suffering and starving, at least we'll be able to say, hey, we didn't increase the fucking deficit. The other big story this week, I think, has to do with some of the information that we're learning coming out about some of the events surrounding the election and the interregnum and January 6th. And some of these thoughts of Mark Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And what we're hearing is kind of confirming a lot of what we already knew. I don't think anything is a big surprise to a lot of people. But the fact that it is coming from someone so senior in the military, I think, is really important. Because this gets back to something I was saying last week. Last week, I was talking about how it's really important that we not downplay what happened, that we don't try to minimize it or say it wasn't that big a deal, you're being dramatic, and so on. And this is just further evidence about this. We have now learned that the top military officer in the country was in fact concerned that the president was not going to want to leave office and that he was taking steps to try to overturn the election. And this was before the election that he was concerned about this. And he felt the need to talk with people and make plans and contingencies for different situations. And he felt that that was something he needed to do. So if someone tells you, look, this wasn't a big deal, it was never going to work, it got a little out of hand, but come on, they were never going to overthrow the government and so on. First of all, whether they actually succeeded or whether they had a real chance of succeeding is not what we should be focusing on. What we should be focusing on is the movement that was underlying it, what's happening with that movement, whether that movement is going away, and whether this type of organization and mobilization is going to happen again in the future. And I think that's still a real risk. Trump is still the leader of the Republican Party, and Trumpism is still the dominant ideology of the right wing in America. And that ideology is anti-democratic, authoritarian, and fascist. And we are now in the crossfires here in California. The Guardian reports just yesterday, 2 men charged in plot to blow up Democratic headquarters in California. So the Guardian reports a detention memo says, quote, they, that's Copeland and Rogers, the 2 men, discussed attacking the California governor's mansion, though the plan later evolved and the Democratic headquarters in California became the target. Other possible targets they discussed included the corporate offices for Twitter and Facebook, unquote. So this is how American politics spills over into California. We have to deal with this now. Now, this fascist movement will never take over California. That's one thing I'm sure of. But the longer we stay in the country, the longer we're tied to the American political system and what's happening in American politics, this is not going to get better. things like this are just going to continue to happen over and over again. Finally, a couple updates on the podcast. I will be dropping an interview on Monday afternoon. Last weekend, I talked to Hal Lohr and Shankar Singham of Red Star Report. I'll link to them in the description. They have a YouTube channel podcast. And we had a really good conversation, about an hour long. And as I said, I'm also going to be starting a little kind of mini-series of topics. Each one maybe about 10 to 15 minutes long. It's going to be called the Top 10 American Threats to California. So it's like these the top 10 lists like David Letterman would have. So it's a top 10 list, but it's not a happy top 10 list. It's not like top 10 Beatles songs or top 10 Seinfeld episodes or top 10 walk-off home runs. No, it's an awful top 10 list. But I think it's an important top 10 list. I think it's important that we really enumerate and have a discussion about what some of these threats are. So those are a couple things coming up in the near future. All right, that's all for me for this week. I'll talk to you next week and look for the interview with Hal and Shankar that'll be coming out this Monday.